Hello everyone. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. It's 9 o'clock. So welcome to panel 28, which is on Who Speaks? Voices of Power, Authority and Trust in Educational Conflict Affected Areas. We've got three really good presentations today, which I'll go through in a second. Just in case this is people, this might be sort of telling everyone what they already knows, but just in case it's people's first panel, we'll go through the presentations first and then do the Q&A. If you've got any questions, feel free to write them out and type them using the questions function while people are presenting, because they won't be coming on stage until, I won't put them on stage until the very end. Gareth is going to be our admin. He'll be monitoring the chat function, so if you're using that, he'll respond to any queries. Similarly, if you use the raise hands function, Gareth will be responding to that. I think that's everything tech-wise. Fingers crossed it all works. We've checked, all the presentations are here, so we think we're ready to go. Just in terms of the presentation we got, so that's a bit bad actually, so don't have to see me. So these are our papers. The first one will be Teachers Are For Everyone, ? The Everyday Political Economy of Education and the Civic Power of Teachers During Conflict in South Sudan. Then we have Education Displaced by the Displaced, a co-creation model for education provision among displaced households in northeast Nigeria. The third one, I think we have a dropout, I haven't heard from this one yet, so we'll then go on to my one, which on the practices, privileges and profits of peace education in Colombia. We're going to have about 15-20 minutes for each paper, as we've only got three, so a bit more time to discuss the ideas, and then we'll open to a Q&A. It was a bit tricky getting a discussant for the panel due to the multiple claims on people's time. So I'll be both presenting and acting as discussant, but I'll put the questions over. I'll open out to the floor first, really, for questions before I ask any. So I think that is everything. I can't see any questions or complaints at the moment. So without further ado, we'll go on to our first panel, our first presentation on Teachers Are For Everyone.
I'm introducing a co-authored paper, which is work in progress, focusing on the everyday political economy of education and the civic power of teachers during the conflict in South Sudan. And this is really a collaboration involving three South Sudanese practical experts who are also researchers at the LSE Conflict Research Programme, together with Alice Robinson at LSE and myself at Goldsmiths. And two of my colleagues, Onyango and Alice, are also present, and Onyango will be joining us from Nimale in South Sudan today, and you can especially turn to him for insights on the questions. Okay, so the title of the paper, Teachers Are For Everyone, basically encapsulates its core arguments, and we explore the extent to which teachers exercise forms of civic power in the classrooms and in their communities, and whether and how they counteract the violent, exclusionary and patriarchal logics of governance which are manifest in the current civil war and the fragile peace in South Sudan, and which I've previously discussed in a book entitled South Sudan's Injustice System. So if we can have the next slide, please. So the presentation will touch on existing literature, and I'm going to explain our approach, share our findings, and in essence, we're really going to show that South Sudan's teachers work in extraordinarily difficult conditions shaped by the conflict and economic crisis. And indeed, some are unable really to work effectively. They may be caught up in violence, petty corruption, malpractice, absenteeism. And this does come out of our research, but I'm not going to dwell on this here. Instead, what we're going to focus on here is that remarkably, teachers still promote civic identities and practices and embody civic authority, which we think is really fundamental for peace building. So if we could have the next slide, please. Now, there's no inherent link between education and peace, as numerous previous studies show. And in order to conceptualize the relationship between teachers and peace building, we turn to recent studies that managed to really get close to the ground, ethnographic studies in other conflict settings. So we looked at Eric van Omering's ethnographic research in Lebanon, which emphasizes the constraints on teachers' capacity to act as peace builders, and also provides a framework for analysis, asking us to look at the context in which teachers work, their relationships with students, their personal biographies, and the resources available to them. And we also were informed by a study of educational practice in Sri Lanka by Cardoso and Hooks, and this characterizes teachers as critical, complex, and perhaps troublesome agents of either transformation or reproduction. So thirdly, we wanted to look a bit beyond those kind of studies which focus on teachers within education to also consider how teachers and schools matter in the political economy of conflict more broadly. And here we learn from work by Christian Lund and others, which explores the plurality of governance and the salience of public authority beyond the sort of formal institutions of the state in governing, and the gap between formal rules and practical norms of real governance, as Jean-Pierre de Sardin and Tom de Hert call it. So the point is here that what goes on in schools matters in our understanding of the state, not only the education sector, but the state as a whole. And as Christophe Dutek and Tom de Hert observe in DRC, the educational system, even where it is, extraordinarily deprived of state resources, can be involved in an evolving negotiation process between state and non-state actors and can function. And in such settings, we think what teachers and schools do is shaping not only the education system, but also with it the idea of the state itself. So if I could have the next slide, please. So here, I want to give a little bit of context on South Sudan. The country is really what the comparativists would call an extreme case, more as a recurrent phenomenon, primary mode of doing things. And as you can see from all the details of the statistics on the slide, it is really extraordinarily lack of education is sort of extremely profound in South Sudan, and the literacy rate is still only just over 30%, and less for women. And teachers are really positioned at the sharp end of an extremely under-resourced system, often with limited or no training, as exemplified in the shocking statistic that over half of primary education teachers are untrained. So we can move to the next slide. And now, we already know from substantial research on South Sudan's education sector by Mario Novelli and his colleagues that there are also troubling inequalities within the education system. And they warn us these risk reinforcing and contributing to conflict and reinforcing divisions. And also very relevantly, Maretta Scaris and Anders Braidlid find in interviews with teachers during the ongoing war in 2014 to 15 that the teachers are really struggling to manage, including in dealing with sensitive topics relating to conflict. However, they also point out that even where the education system itself was deemed to be sort of poor, and teachers were struggling, the school can potentially be an important site where students from various ethnic groups meet and learn together, and thus may contribute to promoting unity. And you could think of this really as a point of departure for our study. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, the case studies. Okay, great. So we focus on teachers' experience in two border areas, Abyei in the north of the country and Nimale in the south of the country. And each side has its own complicated history and kind of contemporary dynamics relating to both conflict and education. And obviously not time to go into detail here, but essentially it's important to note that Abyei remains a disputed area between South Sudan and Sudan and has its own UN peacekeeping mission, but hasn't really been a battleground in the current civil war. Rather, it is a sort of volatile site with intercommunal tension and violence. However, in Nimale in the south, where Onyango is based, in which he can speak to further in questions, the population have really faced violent governmental repression, and many of the original residents have fled as refugees to Uganda. And we've seen a sort of population exchange in a sense as well, because the town where a lot of the interviews were done has also seen people and cattle from other parts of South Sudan who have fled there for sanctuary or come to settle there during the conflict, including to take advantage of the education. which is still the schools that are still functioning there. And both areas, I should underline, are really affected by this kind of constant political repression, everyday injustices, gender inequality of the kind that I describe in my book. But there are, despite all this, schools have continued to function in both sites, and we have quite a bit of information in terms of the statistics, and with regard to education, the two sites appear on paper to be quite different, right? So you can see that ABA has received less international aid, and you can see that, for example, pupil-teacher ratios are high, very high at 66 pupils to a teacher, while in Nimale, there's been more investment, and given that a lot of the schools are really heavily reliant on international aid, as you may have noted from the previous slide, sort of 91% of schools are recipients of international aid. So it's significant that Nimale has received more international aid, and also you see there that the ratio of pupils to teachers is somewhat better, averaging at 38. Yet in practice, what we will show is that there's a lot of similarities between the experiences of teachers in both sites, sort of regardless of this sort of on-paper difference. So if we could have the next slide, please. So here I want to provide just a quick reminder of our research methods. This was a collaborative ethnography involving teachers as participants. 3 of the researchers and co-authors are teachers with really long-term experiential knowledge. I should underline that Onyango is still a deputy head in Nimale. Also the South Sudanese teachers involved in the, as researchers interviewed most of the other teachers, and there were about 90 interviewees between January and 2019 and 20. And we also hosted an action research forum bringing together 12 teachers from Nimale and ABA in September 2019 in Juba, among other kind of sources that we use. Okay, so let me now move on to summarizing our findings and the way that we interpreted them. So if we can have the next slide. Firstly, we reflected on the experiences of teachers, and we had 3 major findings. And go to the next slide already, please. So all the teachers are dealing with issues of trauma and violence on an everyday basis in the classroom and in their personal lives. And to give you a flavor of their observations, in the words of a teacher from Nimale, most of the students are traumatized and they don't want to listen to teachers. And this also forces teachers to steer away sometimes from teaching the history of the conflict, echoing Scaris and Braidwood's findings. And teachers are dealing with a range of students. For instance, in Nimale, Onyango is actually teaching members of security forces, and they're, vulnerable, adult students and so on, and they're vulnerable to direct threats or attacks from parents, teachers, or other members of the community. And a teacher in ABA spoke of an attack on teachers in his school that ended up with one of them having their skull fractured. If we can move to the next slide. A second set of issues emerged around displacement and the constant political uncertainty that has become a norm for most South Sudanese. For instance, many of Nimale's teachers fled to Uganda, leaving a big gap in the education service there, as one teacher put it, and also leaving them precarious, since as refugees, they struggle to find equivalent work or gain recognition for their qualifications. And then even at times when the localities in which they are teaching were more settled, the threat of conflict can be ever present, and neighboring areas can be affected, impacting on dropouts or changes in the school population, as explained in these quotations from MBA, also on the slide. If we can move to the next slide, please. Lastly, consistently in both cases, and indeed across South Sudan, teachers suffered from both low and irregular salary payments. And I can't stress this enough. I mean, it's, a serious problem. Government salaries are frequently delayed as a result of hyperinflation. When they do arrive, they're too low to meet sort of the basic needs. And even those who get top-ups from school fees paid by parents and international aid are really basically still living hand to mouth. And as one teacher in Nimale observed, the salary is barely enough to buy a basin of maize. Another in ABA complained it was too little for soap. And this situation has actually only got worse. Maybe Onyango can talk about that. And so in this context, despite dire conditions, if you can move to the next slide, please. We are, however, able to kind of show that teachers managed to create a sense of civic community beyond the divisions of the conflict, as this photo on the slide suggests. If you can move to the next slide, please. Let's first just say something about the serious limitations of this. Teachers despair that their authority and social powers declined during the conflict, and along with their incomes and training. And for some, their status is now devalued to the equivalent of joining the military. It's one of the last jobs in the nation, as several teachers observed, for an educated person. And this applies in both Nimale and Abyei. And as one interviewee despaired, their reputation is declining to the point that in future, it's unlikely anyone would want to put on the shoe of a teacher, as he put it. Next slide. And yet, remarkably, in this very difficult context, teachers spoke of their commitment to fostering civic community within schools. Several spoke of their initiatives to counteract tribalism, attempts to challenge gender inequalities. And they said that teachers respond to the prejudices and discrimination that are being socially entrenched. And they advise their students that all should be treated and given equal opportunities in the best cases. If you can move to the next slide, please. Our interviews also provide rich examples of initiatives and practices, including sports clubs, debates, drama clubs, which directly aimed at promoting peace and the idea of a civic nation. So, for instance, one described a peace club whose activities sort of were animated by the principle that we are one nation and let us be in peace. Next slide. Now, we already know that teachers work often voluntarily on extremely low pay, so it's good reason to question why on earth they would be willing to put themselves at risk, struggle against discrimination, innovate with clubs and activities in the ways that have been described. And in our understanding, what animates their efforts, and maybe Onyango can also speak more to this, is a fervent belief among many teachers that their role is vital for the welfare of their students, for their local community, and for the peaceful development of the nation. And their education has also given them the social resources, skills, norms, and networks to actually do something positive in the community. And it still endows them with a measure of recognition and respect. They still feel socially valued. In an interview, even though this has declined, and in an interview in Nimale, a teacher described how a relationship with a former teacher actually saved his life. Many others spoke of various ways that people in their community recognize their contribution. As one said, why I like teaching is the respect. It helps me. I feel like a teacher is more important than a president. Next slide. So several teachers elaborated on the idea that teachers were building and bridging divisions, that they worked in the interests of everyone, that they tried to make good people in their classrooms. But disturbingly, their desire to contribute to nation building and to and their sort of skills and authority have been increasingly diverted into the international peace building enterprises, where salaries are more regular and are much higher. And on an individual level, getting a job with an NGO is understandably an attractive choice. Yet teachers themselves worry about the ways in which the education sector has been hollowed out by the opportunities in the humanitarian NGO sector and by the prioritization given to the latter over the salaries of teachers. And they recognize that NGOs are concerned with short-term emergency response, unlike the sort of longer-term autonomous South Sudanese kind of education system engaged with building the future of the nation. Okay, so the last slide, finally. In conclusion, adopting a similar contextualized approach, we find much to substantiate the need to recognize the real constraints on teachers' capacity to act as peace builders. They're subject to violence, deprived of resources, face enormous challenges, including their own everyday survival. And yet, there is ample evidence in South Sudan of their strategic agency in the interests of peace. They cultivate civic spaces, practices of reasoning, learning, and discussion. And as Teachers Interaction Research Forum expressed it, they aspire to, I mean, you know, whether or not they always succeed, they aspire to creating inclusive civic spaces, many of them, calling it a global family that contains everyone, regardless of ethnicity and religion. And so in a highly militarized and unstable context, it is politically significant that although they're underpaid, teachers are still respected. They embody a kind of social, symbolic capital or prestige that Bourdieu describes as sort of political resource. And this may be in decline in a context where humanitarian aid workers and peace builders are much wealthier in terms of economic resources. And many of the best teachers have deserted education to join the formal peace builders. Yet schools are potential and existing hubs for humanitarian support. Teachers are potentially consistent long-term peace builders or frontline state builders, as South Sudanese public intellectual Luca Byong Deng observed when we talked to him about this work. And finally, we regard the everyday expressions of civicness by teachers in South Sudan as politically significant and potentially counter-hegemonic. I'll finish there.
Right, okay. I believe I'm on now. So thank you, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for that presentation. Okay. So I'll be speaking on education for the displaced by the displaced, a co-creation model, and it's very interesting hearing Rachel presentation. Am I correct? I think that's Rachel. Okay, because there are some intersection there in terms of the context in which we are looking at. So this is part of a broader project that have been undertaken with colleagues in Northeast Nigeria. We have been carrying out some studies for the past few years. The first study we undertook was on entrepreneurship education, and to see how this can help young people in the region acquire the right kind of skills to be able to actually create opportunities for themselves in that very quite challenging context. But of course, so education is a big issue also in Northeast Nigeria, where the Boko Haram insurgency started about 2 decades ago now, in 2002. Right. Okay. Thanks, Rob. So yes, because the Boko Haram ideology actually has to do with their rejection of Western education. And the term Boko Haram actually means Western education is forbidden, or Western education is outlawed, or something to that effect. So please, if you please go to the next slide, Rob, thank you. So in the course of this short presentation, I'll be going over, just introducing, giving the background to the study, and then talk about, the context of forced displacement and the education, and of course, then go back to the Northeast Nigerian context, and then come to the final point, which is the model, the co-creation model of education provision that these projects seeks to explore. Please, if you can go to the next slide. So I think the first thing is to talk about the context of forced displacement, which is a peculiar setting for this study, and it's a global phenomenon. It's not just something that is limited to northern Nigeria, where the Boko Haram insurgency has been a big problem over the years. But over the past few decades, the toll of forced displacement throughout the world has increased significantly as a result of persecution. You know what the sort of thing that happened in Bangladesh with the Rohingyas, for example. Civil wars, in different parts of the world. Seeing what is happening in Syria, what's happened in most parts of the Middle East and some African countries. And of course, transborder conflict as well as natural disasters as well. So according to the recent report from the UNCHR, about more than 70 million people have been forcibly displaced throughout the world. About 26 million of them are refugees in different places, and more than 41 million are internally displaced people. And a lot of time when, in humanitarian, discourse, when we have conversation, there's a lot of focus and programming that are actually targeted at refugees. There is not a lot, comparatively, focusing on internally displaced because of that peculiar situation. There's a population that are constantly on the move. Sometimes it's actually difficult to register or actually categorize who is internally displaced and who is not, and a whole range of things. But I will not be dwelling too much on that. Please go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so among these statistics, these gloomy statistics of forced displacement, there is actually something about children that have been affected. At the end of 2018, more than 17 million children have been forcibly displaced and as a result of violence and conflict. Of course, that is aside from those who have been displaced by natural disaster, so it's quite a big number overall. And one of the main consequences of this is the disruption to children's education. And we just take a few examples. In Iraq, less than a third of children have access to any form of education as a result of displacement due to the conflict and that has ravaged the country. The same thing, similarly in Yemen, only about a third are enrolled in schools. And when you look then at sub-Saharan Africa, more than half of all the out of school children are actually from sub-Saharan Africa. So this is quite a big problem. Please, next slide. Okay, so there is also something about this lack of access to education and how it aggravates or precipitates, sometimes also aggravates conflict. And if you look at some of the more recent figures from the UNDP, it shows that the countries that are lower in Human Development Index are also the same countries that have experienced or recently experienced armed conflict. And there's this quote: "It's a violent conflict destroys the education infrastructure." So this is why it has happened. Because when education infrastructures are destroyed, children will have much limited access. It reduces spending on schools and teachers because government and humanitarian agencies are probably prioritizing other things, especially government, national and local government. And also because in the situation of conflict, schools are easy targets for violent groups that want to get at government. And this has especially happened in Northeast Nigeria. I'll come back to that in a minute. Please, if you go to the next slide. So I think the issue there is that violence and lack of access to education are mutually aggravating. And there is also something there in the long-term consequence, because children who do not have access to education down the line are going to become part of the challenges and the problem that the countries have to reckon with. Education and training provides children with these abilities that can be functional members so that they can contribute to society, so that they can have that sense of ownership and that stake in shared prosperity in society. Because through education they can they can acquire skills that can be used either in formal employment or in self-employment, which helps them to achieve livelihood outcomes and also contribute to national, economic outcomes as well. But beyond these, outcome or this benefit in terms of skill acquisition, it also actually is a source of psychosocial support. because children, when they're in the school environment, they can, of course, interact with their peers, and that isolation, which can actually, worsen, trauma, is reduced at least. It also reduces vulnerabilities and risk, because in many of these conflict zones, and certainly in the case of Sudan as well, I know, and in Northeast Nigeria, there's a lot of involvement of children, being recruited as child soldiers or being victims of sexual violence and exploitation. So there is something there about the imperative of education there for children who are displaced. And of course, it also, fosters and encourages inclusion and diversity. Please, to the next slide. Okay, I will run quickly through this. So these are some of the challenges. I think I did mention earlier on that a lot of programming that are aimed at forcibly displaced people, do not really account properly for internally displaced. You find that most of the data, there's no disaggregation in terms of who are the refugees and who are those who are still in those countries, but they're actually displaced. And according to some studies by UNICEF, only 14% of countries actually have any disaggregated data that is focusing on IDPs. And there are challenges, like you mentioned, due to lack of resources. And girls face additional challenges, some of them cultural, some of them, of course, gendered, violence, forced marriage. But there are also, so this limit the access of children. So, but there are also issues of quality. And I think this is also one of the key things in our consideration in the model that we're proposing. Yeah. Thank you, Rob. So, more often than not, in situations of conflict, government and stakeholders employ informal schooling because they see it as short term. But what we have seen in recent years is that forced displacement has become a protracted issue. So a short-term kind of approach, informal schooling strategy, is not something that can work in the long term for displaced children. But also crucially, a lot of interventions are very much top-down. There is a lot of development aid that is going into this sector, and some of the programming are not suited to the needs, to the realities of the local context. And of course, there are other challenges of limited supply of qualified teachers, because either some teachers have been subject to violence, and many are not really, of course, keen to work in places where there is violence. Please, to the next slide. Okay, so in the Nigerian context, as you know, Nigeria is the most populous African country, and about half of the population and a third of the youth are actually illiterate, according to the UNESCO estimate 2 years ago, probably maybe even worse now, to be honest. And the number of out-of-school children has increased rapidly. And the area of the country that we looked at in this study is actually the worst affected area in terms of literacy. And like we said before, girls and disabled children have borne the brunt of the insurgency. Next slide, please. So the Boko Haram insurgency itself started, more than 2 decades ago. But it was in 2002 it became a violent movement. And as of now, it has actually resulted in the displacement of more than 3 million people, and tens of thousands of lives, have been lost. And education infrastructures have become prime target for that very reason, that Boko Haram is about opposition to Western education, essentially. And in Borno State, which is the epicenter, more than 500 primary and secondary schools have been closed down because of destruction and vandalization by the insurgents. Next slide, please. So again, you can see there, what are the challenges? And this is actually important within this particular context, because I was talking about earlier on that some of the programming do not take into account or adequately take into account the local realities, the nuances, and the peculiarities of the local context. Historically, cultural and political factors have played a key role in the uptake of formal education in northern Nigeria. There has been lukewarm attitude, partly because some have seen Western education as an instrument of proselytization. Others have seen actually, and this is not peculiar to northern Nigeria, that there is very low returns to education in terms of employment, which may be some might say is a narrow view of the returns to education, but it's very, very important, and maybe topmost, consideration in a place like Nigeria where, job opportunities are limited. And the education policy is also very top-down in the country. It's only in recent years there has been a bit more in terms of consulting, the public and local population. And of course, there are also challenges of falling standards across the country as well. A lack of qualified teachers because of low incentives, similar to what we hear was happening in South Sudan. Salaries, are quite low. There's, quality assurance processes are quite, limited and inadequate. Next slide, please. So, so the model, I was going to mention that we were going to go to the field earlier in the year before the COVID-19 intervened, sort of. So we still plan to do that. So my discussion today is mainly conceptual. So there are three guiding principles that underpins, the co-creation approach for resourcing embedded enterprise education, like we call it. The first one, of course, is the community involvement. That is not something that humanitarian agencies just come to present to the community, but it is something that should involve, members of the community in terms of what are the ideas. And this is especially important in a place like Northeast Nigeria, where a lot of people see this intervention as something that is external, something that is foreign, something that they have no input in, something that is foisted on them. So we are recommending that in terms of resourcing teachers and learning mentors, that should be within the community, because this is a constantly moving community. And one of the main problems is lack of teachers, and that is because you cannot expect somebody to come from another part of the country recruited to teach in these schools that you don't know when else they're going to move. Now there's an opportunity to actually look into the community to see what are the existing resources that are there, and then to recruit members of these communities themselves, to be engaged in, to be trained, to be put on a training program. So that is one. So the community aspect in terms of recruiting, in terms of co-opting also local artisans as vocational trainers, but also the action-based learning aspect of it, in order to enhance the quality of delivery, but also the quality of outcomes as well. And also to actually take into account, pupils, peculiar needs and aspirations. And then also the link between the academic, knowledge and real life application. This is especially very important because it's one of the reasons why a lot of parents are reluctant to let their wards and children be involved, because they see it as a waste of time, which is narrow, of course, but you need to come to the middle, there where you actually provide the utilitarian function of education, and of course the academic outcomes as well. The last slide, actually, now, please, the next one, which is effectively the last slide. So this is what our care model looks like. So we have a mapping of the curriculum there, which identifies some core subjects in terms of functional skills, as well as enterprise skills, which is very important in terms of entrepreneurial, assessing entrepreneurial opportunities. And then we're linking this with vocational components, that every child should also have an opportunity to access vocational training at that level. And that will increase, of course, the sense of value and the gain and the returns. Then we also talk about the community-oriented resource strategy in terms of the personnel that are involved in delivering education, but also in terms of both the academic aspect and the vocational aspect. but also the infrastructure as well, as well as support technologies. So that comes under, the community, approach. And then all of this then interacting together will lead to those 4 outcomes in terms of attainment and personal development, in terms of local capacity development, the livelihood outcomes, and of course the peace building outcomes as well. So I will stop there now. I think I've probably spoken for close to 20 minutes already. So when we get to the discussion, we can discuss. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to Rachel and Sayan. You just have to imagine the thunderous applause that came at the end of your presentations. Yeah, really interesting, and looking forward to the discussions and seeing some of the links between what you've been looking at and mine. Okay, so I'm going to talk about reproducing power through peace education, a case study of elite and non-elite schools in Colombia. This is part of my thesis. Well, this is my thesis. I'm going to just not discuss the whole thing, but just a chapter of it, and what hopefully be turning into an article at some point. So looking forward to the discussion and getting some feedback. So I'm just going to give a bit of background on the context of Colombia to begin with, just to situate what I'm going to be talking about, then move on to the research questions I'm interested in, link this a bit to the literature, so why I'm interested in these questions, then how I went about answering them, what I thought I found, and why I thought it was important. So, in terms of the context, there's obviously a huge amount of information that you could give in terms of the history of conflict in Colombia, the also history of peace. But I also want to focus on 2 things, really. The first is a 2014 law that was passed called the Cátedra de la Paz. This law mandated that all educational institutions have to contribute towards teaching or towards creating a culture of peace. Possibly like quite a lot of laws in Colombia, it is heavy on very good intentions, such as making sure that teaching peace or contributing towards a culture of peace shouldn't just be pigeonholed within a particular subject, but should underpin the entire curriculum, but is slightly light on details on how to go about achieving it. There were then further decrees that gave more practical details to teachers and more advice, and quite a lot of charities and organizations are also working with schools on how to go about implementing it. But partly because the education system in Colombia is very decentralized, which is a result of having such a diverse country, local municipalities and local schools have a very wide latitude to interpret what contributing towards cultural peace means and how to go about it. And this, fairly unsurprisingly, has resulted in a lot of confusion about what this law means, as well as a bit of buck passing in terms of who has responsibility for it, and not a whole lot of action as a result. The second important contextual bit of information is the very contested meaning of what peace is in Colombia. This is perhaps summarized by one of the pupils in a school I was working within, who said he was for peace but against the peace agreement, as very famously, or infamously, in Colombia in 2016, when I went to a referendum, the people voted against accepting the peace agreement between the government and the FARC. During this referendum, the previous president, Álvaro Uribe, and his Centro Democrático party, they campaigned vociferously against the peace agreement, and they were accused of spreading misinformation by telling the people that the government was trying to spread communism, spread atheism, and gender realignment under the rubric of peace. And now the current president, who's called Iván Duque, he's widely perceived to be a protege, if not a puppet, of Uribe. And during his tenure, when I was there, there's been lots of demonstrations against him and his government because they haven't been implementing the terms of the peace deal. And he's responded by labeling these protesters as enemies of the peace in turn, because they've been disrupting security and calling them terrorists, essentially. So we can already see here the very contested understanding of what peace means, and with its someone's interpretation of it is very heavily dependent upon their interpretation of the conflict, and also often their experience of the conflict as well. So within this context, what I'm interested in looking at is overall is how does the variation between different meanings and practices of peace education reproduce or challenge the power relations of their context. And specifically within this chapter, I'm interested in thinking about how is peace education influenced by being taught within an unequal education system? And if at all, peace education can begin to address and overcome these inequalities. So the reason I'm interested in these questions is that what education means is a key debate within the literature. And it can be broken down into questions of what is actually being taught, so what's the content of peace education, then what is the vision of a peaceful society that education should be contributing towards, and what is the link between these two? So how is it that education should be or can be contributing towards making society more peaceful? Within this literature, there are tensions between people who have, or academics who have tried to create a more universal or integrative model of peace education, which then can be adapted and applied within particular contexts. And other academics who have argued that any attempt to create a more universal approach to peace education will inevitably be built on, very broadly speaking, positivist and modernist understandings of knowledge, individuals, the state, and peace. And this will inevitably marginalize alternative conceptions and also help work to reproduce the same conditions that led to pervasive conflict in the first place. But where I kind of see my work fitting in is lots of this debate is fairly theoretical at the moment, although this is starting to change. And articles often end by calling for more theoretical work, looking at how power dynamics actually work within particular contexts. So what I wanted to observe really was if and how the meaning of peace and peace education varies according to different power relations within the Colombian educational context. And then what are the consequences of these variations for this purpose of using education to contribute towards making society more peaceful? This required two things, really. The first it required was a theory of how power functions in an educational context. For this, I've been referring quite heavily to Bourdieu and his framework of habitus, field, and capital, for the reason that it provides quite a clear approach for understanding how hierarchies work in education through the relative accumulation of capital, then how education reproduces the status quo through capital exchange, and then also through understanding the contest between accepted and unaccepted forms of knowledge and which have legitimacy within a particular field through this idea of contest over capital. So that was one thing that I thought required. And the second is a clear research design for observing power differentials. So to answer these questions, I really wanted to see how peace education or the Caso de la Paz law is being taught in schools that represented inequalities within the Colombian education system. Now, obviously, I couldn't look at all schools or, even a representative sample within the confines of a PhD. So I wanted to select some for particular reasons. So I spent a couple of weeks in two schools in northern Bogota. Now, these two schools are on the same road, so one on either side, and you can look into the staff from one school from the other school. So they couldn't really be any geographically closer, but they inhabit opposite socioeconomic realities. In fact, one of teachers from one school joked to me that you would need a visa to travel from one to the other because they are different countries. And there really is the feeling you get. So the school I refer to as School 1 is an elite, all-male private Catholic school. The students who attend there come from very wealthy families who go on to have careers in politics and business, often family businesses. They're not from the local area. Every morning they're driven in on this fleet of SUVs, really, tinted SUVs, into the gates of the school. And the school itself has vast resources. It has several football fields, grass football fields, has a chapel, observatory, and even an observatory. Though given the air pollution in Bogota, it seems slightly futile, and regular trips to Europe for the students. Whereas School 2 is what in Britain we call a state school. If not in Britain, it's called a public school. A mixed school, so male and female, catering to the local community who live on the mountainside, essentially, in self-created communities. There's a heavy presence of informal and illegal market within both the students and also their wider networks. And there's one concrete playground as the resource and two security guards outside the gates, in contrast to School 1, which was very heavily militarized. It had a military division guarding it, essentially, due to the presence of one pupil. So we've got these two vastly different schools within very close proximity to each other. So when I went there, I interviewed the social sciences department because they have responsibility really for teaching peace as part of this requirement. To ask them what they did, what they thought about what they were doing, what they thought the purpose of peace education was and how they interpreted these terms. And then I did the same with year 11 pupils in terms of their responses, how they what they'd learned, their attitudes towards it. Okay, so that's broadly speaking the context of what I was trying to do. In terms of what I found, I just want to go through 3 key findings first. The first one is the idea of peace as a form of privilege. And this came up a lot from teachers from School 1 who would tell me that the pupils they were teaching were extremely privileged, both economically and socially, and that their responsibility, their job really as teachers was to give them a sense of responsibility. They would use this privilege to help others. And the first line of this quote really encapsulates it when the teacher told me that the intention was to make these guys more human, but also the fact that this goal is tough. And this came up again and again when I interviewed these teachers. And the rest of the quote really gives an example of how teachers can know if they have succeeded in making their students more human by seeing how they interact with people who provide them with their services. And essentially, if the pupils treat these people who are beneath them in the socioeconomic hierarchy with some respect and almost as equals, then the school and the teacher will know they've done a good job. But the problem with this approach is that it doesn't really fundamentally challenge any of the power relations in society. It just puts a more polite face on them. In the scenario outlined above, the pupil is still far richer and more powerful than the person providing him with a service. But instead of using this privilege to be rude or abusive, he is respectful and kind. And this imbalance of power really seemed to be an essential part of how teachers and also pupils as well perceive the role of peace education, as the teachers hoped that by the pupils combining the privilege conferred upon them by their birth and also the education provided by them by the school, they would use this, both this education and this background, to work for peace in the country. And the pupils themselves reiterated this message. This might not mean they believed it, but at least shows that they'd understood this enough to be able to repeat it to a stranger asking them some slightly odd questions. But this approach really reiterates the idea that working for peace requires a form of privilege, as the pupils explained that they didn't just have responsibility because of their background, but also that their education had provided them with the knowledge and the skills to work effectively. And indeed, the curriculum is very much set up like this. It looked at the causes of conflict and then looked at the solutions to conflict. So it gave them the sense that we are in quite a good position now to work for peace, however they were interpreting this. But these privileges, by definition, are not available to the majority of students within Colombia. So this approach still reinforced the idea that peace building and work for peace is an elite activity, and one which requires a certain amount of privilege to participate within. So that was one finding. The second one was trying to avoid the othering effects of peace, because in the first school, many of the students would tell me, look, I'm not responsible for the fact there's so much violence. Me personally, there's nothing to do with me, but I still want to, most of them say, I still want to work for peace. I'm not sure about that, but that was the majority response. And this was still evident, and the teachers didn't really challenge this, whereas the pupils from School 2, they still had this sense of, what's it got to do with me? But the teachers there were very, very clear that this was a narrative they had to counter, and that for them, learning about peace and conflict meant, among other things, reflecting about their own experiences of violence, their own experiences of what it meant to grow up in a very deprived neighborhood, essentially. And the consequences of this approach were that people should value their own experiences as being important for peace or wider peace within the country, and that any definition of it should be meaningful for them and what they live through every day. And also the process towards working to achieve it has to include their participation. The ideal end result of this was that pupils would feel a peaceful society is a goal to work towards because it directly benefits them and crucially involved a material improvement for their lives. So that was an important finding in terms of the contrast between schools 1 and 2. The third finding I want to talk about was the role of the state, because this came across very different within each school as well. The quote here from a teacher from School 2 really exemplified extremely adversarial relationship between the teachers and not just this current government, but all governments really stretching back, although they saw some like kind of differences between them, but it was marginal really. As rhetoric from previous governments had portrayed teachers as dangerous kind of communists and dangerous ideologues who were indoctrinating children into communism. This made the teachers extremely wary of any attempts to any central attempts to enforce peace education, especially as the lack of any, or the limited investment in public education made the practicalities of teaching peace because of large school sizes, a lack of training, very, very difficult. And meanwhile, the realities of living in an unequal society, which the state does little to ameliorate, meant that students found themselves with often little alternative but to work in the legal sectors and informal sectors. So while students they'd often espouse saying we need to, empathy is important, living in harmony is important, they'd often live in ways that contradict them through no real fault of their own, just through their personal circumstances, force them into. But in many ways, the greater influence of the state on teachers from school 2 is no surprise, because it's after all a public school rather than a private school. But the key contrast between these schools over how they perceive the state is also illustrative of the very different challenges facing school 1 and school 2. Because for school 1, the main factor determining whether successful peace education is possible is simply the school management. With a supportive school management, what they perceive as peace education is still difficult but achievable. Whereas for school 2, the main factor preventing successful peace education is the actions of the state, which they have very, 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 very limited control over. So for them, it means peace education seems an almost unachievable goal. And these two perceptions demonstrate a very fundamental difference in what peace education means in these contexts. As for teaching in school 1, it was primarily about witnessing behavioural change in their students. So ensuring they have enough knowledge about the history of the conflict, and also developed a set of soft skills based primarily around empathy that they can demonstrate. Whereas for school 2, and so beyond like enforcing providing requirement and enforcement, the state doesn't play a huge role in ensuring the success or failure of this version of peace education. Whereas for teachers from school 2, it's meant ensuring that the students have better access to higher education, more secure careers, and more prosperous lives, which naturally is much more in the control of the state to provide rather than the schools themselves. And while this interpretation definitely included the behavioural skills that teachers in school 1 were discussing, it was a much broader understanding. So those were essentially the findings. Why do I think they're important? Well, what we see here, I think, is very clearly that the ambiguity of peace as a term is leading to the context determining the meaning of peace and also peace education, as these schools are meters apart and yet inhabiting completely different socioeconomic realities. And these realities have shaped what peace education means. The teachers in school 1 that I spoke to were nearly all socially conscious and nearly all professed left-wingers, who were also resisting pressure from the parents who had accused them of indoctrinating their pupils into communism. Yet they were also teaching peace in a way that aligns with the interests and traditions of the schools and its pupils. This contrasted with what peace means to the second school, where its meaning was much more rooted within the lives and experience of its pupils, and matches their aspirations for materially improving their lives. So the meaning and practice of peace education has changed dramatically, or according to the context in which it is taught, which is a clear example of the effect the ambiguity of this term has. So that was one. But why is this variation of meanings matter? Is it not just a case of adapting to the local contexts? Well, I think it's in both contexts, a hierarchy of peace has been created. In school 1, this hierarchy is determined according to who is most able to acquire a specific set of skills, knowledge, and behaviour that is associated with peace. Whereas in school 2, a hierarchy is created where who is considered to be most at peace is determined by who is most able to materially improve their lives. But this also creates a hierarchy between the schools, as pupils from school 1 already have the material comfort that pupils from school 2 associated with peace. So here we have the meaning of peace education replicating the class-based inequalities that are at least partially responsible for the violence and conflict that has plagued Colombia for decades, if not centuries. The final step, and this is where I'm finishing, is thinking about how this evidence relates to a wider theory of how power functions in education. So for Bourdieu, the structure of power in a society is the structure of the relative accumulation of capital. In both conceptions of peace education, those who are most privileged of pupils from School 1 are in a better position to acquire the capital, whether it is soft skills or material wealth, that assures an individual's position within the field of peace education, which again suggests that it is just another route through which the existing inequalities of Colombian society are reinforced. But the flexibility of meaning also suggests a method for challenging current power relations, as centering peace education around the experiences of all pupils, as the teachers from School 2 are attempting, could change the type of capital that regulates the field of peace education and make it more accessible to those who come from poor backgrounds. But the question remains of whether this version of peace education, which divorces it from its connection to a material improvement in living conditions, will still be meaningful for these pupils. But here we do see an example of the malleability of meaning of peace education, offering the space to create a more equitable version of education. Okay, so I am going to leave it there, and again, have to imagine the thunderous applause that's finishing from the audience. And we'll go to the Q&A. If they don't mind, I'm just going to get Sayun and I think it's Onyango for up for the questions. And then Gareth, would you mind checking the questions and then possibly asking them as well? So the brazen corruption in the civil service space that enriches the workers. So aren't there other underlying reasons, therefore, that than the low educational return to this violence? So this seems to be more a question of the state, really. So what is the state's role in preventing higher educational returns? That you discussed there wasn't many returns on education. So what role does the state play in ensuring this situation?
I mean, yes, I think I mean there are other things apart from education itself. You know, there are institutional factors, which is always an issue in developing countries. So there is, of course, I think the structure of the civil service itself is so large and not necessarily fit for purpose. So I mean, so there are issues with government, with the way government is disincentivizing, productivity, especially in the northern part of the country sometimes. But I think the point of the model we are putting forward is not so much that people will then be able to get more formal employment in the public sector, but if this is co-created within the community, is likely to produce better returns in terms of skill acquisition that will then enable these young people to actually create things for themselves rather than waiting for employment in the public sector. And I think this is not an argument that applies uniquely only to northern Nigeria, but to other parts of the country. But of course, the particular context we are looking at is that of forced displacement, which of course has affected northern Nigeria. And of course, there's also the problem of unemployment, which has aggravated, the insurgency itself. So in order to actually address that in a kind of integrated manner, you need to deliver the kind of education that enable these young people to then access better opportunity, that will make them less vulnerable to terrorist recruitment, but that will also contribute, to development in the region and therefore, mitigate, the circumstances that, lead or escalate the violence in the first place.
Thanks a lot for that. There's another question for you. This is from Rachel, actually, the presenters. I'll just publish it. So she would like to ask you whether the co-creation model might have a wider significance beyond the schools for existence in challenging the Boko Haram narratives about education. Actually, on that point, I was wondering, with answering that question, could you expand a little bit on what the Boko Haram vision of education was? Because you said it was obviously destroying, it's sort of education as haram, I think. But so could you tell us a little bit more about what this vision of education entails?
Okay, maybe if I will start from where Rob ended there. I think the Boko Haram narrative, propaganda about Western education is that first, it does not, prioritize religious precepts or values, and it is elitist in the sense that it has actually led to, escalation of, inequalities within society and and push more and more people to the fringes. And therefore, to the extent that education in the region has been has been detrimental, or has actually led to further inequality. It is evil. It is not right. It is therefore forbidden. And their vision of a kind of Islamic kind of education is the one that they believe will be more egalitarian, if you like. But I think and I think Rachel is right then. That the co-creation model is not just something that delivers value in terms of enabling young people to have skills that they can create things for themselves. It also challenges the Boko Haram narrative, because in the first instance it becomes more of a leveler, because it provides wider access to young people who otherwise would not be able to have that access. But also, it also provides a kind of a functional value beyond the academic knowledge, that actually you can go and learn new vocational skills. You can actually learn things that you can use in real life. So it's actually a very important corrective in that sense of the Boko Haram narrative, because parents who otherwise will feel that it is a waste of time. These children should help us in the farm and so on and so forth, rather than going to learn books that would not be of any value because they can't get jobs. So I think they will have a different view, because they can then see that there are actually outcomes here in terms of economic outcomes and value as well, and are more likely then to embrace that. But also because of the co-creation aspect, that it's not just that you are sending children to school, but you're actually helping to generate the resources within the community, including human resources as well as other material resources. And you're also involved in delivering it, in terms of the vocational aspect. So the sense of ownership actually is very, very important in terms of saying, this is not something that is fostered, by the West. This is something that we actually co-created within the community. And so the Boko Haram insurgent cannot come and say that, well, this is something Western, because it is owned by the community.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. There's lots more interesting questions about I thought about the narratives of education that are coming, because you mentioned about the care your model being a rejection of kind of Western narratives, but also how that links to Boko Haram possibly being also a rejection of Western narratives. But we'll just maybe you've asked a lot of questions. So Rachel has one for me, which is whether I ask the questions, whether I ask the teachers about their own experience of conflict, and if this is also relevant for their teaching. Essentially, I did, especially like I said, because it's such a contested understanding of the history of conflict, depending on one's political positions. I meant that question, and wants to essentially being displaced, because Colombia has had a huge history of internal displacement from the country into the cities, where I was doing my field work. It very much it seemed to inform the teachers who'd experienced this, their desire to show that the conflict wasn't just this abstract agreement which they saw on the TV between the government and the FARC, but it's something that is in many ways responsible for their experience of everyday life, to the extent of where in fact they are living. And because it seems to be the more the teacher generation who had experienced this displacement, they wanted to show to the pupils that they're the consequence of this displacement, I suppose. So yeah, in many ways that was relevant. I'll just check if there's any more questions before I've one from Alice. Actually, I'll do this one. I'll come to you, Rachel, if you don't mind. So I'll just publish this one. So thanks for Rob. Did the teachers from S1, S2 have much contact with each other, and were you able to discuss your findings with them, and what were their reflections? Okay, yes. So the only connection that I was aware that they had is essentially my contact who worked in the very much richer school. He took the same bus as one of the teachers from the secondary school, and that was how he essentially had the contact with the much poorer school. One was the state school, and how he got me in essentially. But that was the only contact they had. And for the pupils from school One, there was like they were aware of the school, but they didn't seem to have much interest in it, or much. It didn't really seem to impinge on them. Whereas for the pupils from school two and the teachers, it was a huge sort of it really bared on their reality. Partly because as a result of the school, this area of the city was extremely militarized, and there was a very high value pupil who just started attending that school. And as soon as he started attending, the police department immediately built a new police station and started patrolling the streets. So, and they were there's a lot of hostility. One of the teachers said, how can they teach peace when these people are the ones responsible for conflict, essentially? So there just seemed this complete contradiction in terms of how could it make any sense to them. So that seemed to be, people from in the area and from the school were very aware of the presence of this richer school, whereas vice versa, it didn't seem to be the case. So for Rachel, so you really thought it was such an interesting discussion, especially when you discussed about the limited role of that teachers have as peace builders and their ability to be kind of civic authorities. Can you discuss maybe a bit more about how the role of the state was in, if it existed at all within the lives of the pupils, and if it affected their and the teachers as well, if it affected their understanding of the role of education and their role as trying to create ability, as I think you were describing it.
In terms of the provision of education, the state is only one of the providers, right? So actually what we've found, looking into it in more detail, through looking at policy reports as well as looking at the from the ground perspectives, we've increasingly understood that actually it's communities that are providing this education in large respect. And in fact, if Onyango could speak now, he would also be able to tell you the impact, for instance, of the COVID-19, where the schools have closed, has really further demonstrated this, because they're no longer in schools, and therefore they're no longer getting the school fees from the communities. Basically, parents who are paying fees are largely sustaining these schools in some places. And we've also had other, not just from the two localities that we looked at, but wider sort of scoping of education experiences in other places from a wider network of researchers. And you find that even, like businesses might have given a donation, religious groups, fees, etc. So the state is only one provider, right? And it seems almost like in many schools, what they're trying to do is also sustain themselves through multiple sources of income, including, as we mentioned, international aid. And in fact, there's been important support, including from the Department of International Development, girls' education in South Sudan, aid provision which supports both girls directly and teachers' salaries, and by the European Union as well, which also provides support for teachers. But almost like the state itself in a way, and partly because it also goes through elements of the state, the funding has various layers to go to before it actually reaches the schools. Again, this is not terribly reliable, right? So, it's a patching together, it's improvisation, it's kind of making do at the local level to get a school running, it seems, from what we've seen. So that's one thing within the education sector. And then, of course, secondly, if the country is basically being in conflict. So the state, what is the state? Well, it's fragmented, it's plural, it's contested, and it's also the source of violence in many places. So, and in fact, the state is the source of violence, having destroyed schools. There was a picture in our presentation of one of the schools in, this was not actually in Nimale itself, but in the wider surrounding area of Pageri, which had, teachers had basically had to flee. The school had been closed down. So like in the case of the Sayam's Boko Haram, there have been schools that have had to close down as a result of the conflict as well, in South Sudan. And that's been partly an impact of government soldiers occupying schools in Pageri area, for instance, occupying schools and making them into military headquarters. This is something we've seen quite significantly. And indeed, also the state is manifest even in the pupils. It's very interesting, for instance, that Onyango has amongst his pupils, in a country where illiteracy has been so high, many people have never had the chance, including many state officials and employees of the police and the government at different levels, or the national security. And so some of them are actually being sent back to school, and teachers are having to also teach them in their classrooms, which is, in many ways a great, opportunity for education. And, but again, is, there's plural ways, I guess, in which this sort of notion of the state, but what we're sort of trying to argue is that the schools themselves are potentially one of the main expressions of the civic state, if you like, because service delivery is negligible. What is the state in South Sudan? Well, Alex Duval has described it as kind of violent kleptocracy. So actually, sorry, my cat. Whereas the state is absent in many ways, or violent, and yet the schools themselves are providing a service. One of the few services that is provided may not be exactly coming from the state, but it's representing the state in some way, and this is why we see it additionally as politically significant.
Okay, I actually want to follow up just before I say that. I was going to enable an open podium, so if anyone from the audience wants to pop up, so to speak, and ask a question, feel free. So just following on from that, so schools get their budget essentially from lots of different sources, international, national, and local, essentially,
yeah.
Who might have differing priorities and sort of perspectives. Is there any consequence on that? You said schools' activities on teaching peace, on like having classrooms of peace. Do you see this conflict?
Sorry, I'm just gonna remove my cat from my...
With cat-based issues.
Right, sorry.
No problem. So yeah, do you see this potential tension between interests manifesting within the activities that teachers do for when they do these peace-based activities?
I mean, I think some of those peace-based activities that we described are really very much coming from the bottom up. So it's not, the curriculum in South Sudan had to be remade after independence in 2011. So everything is new in many ways in South Sudan, and the textbooks have never reached the schools in most cases, right? So there's a curriculum, a South Sudanese curriculum, but teachers are improvising with books from the previous Sudan, with books from Kenya, with books from Uganda. They're having to improvise with very limited resources. And as far as peace education goes, this is again, largely the innovations of teachers, potentially also sometimes I think, with NGOs in the community, just depends on the local site. But there's no systematic element to this. It's not in the same way that you described Colombia, a very clear peace education curriculum, which is being implemented in different ways with with teachers interpreting it differently in different schools. Rather, it is actually, teachers on the ground with very, very limited resources, patching together ideas about how to generate positive experiences for their students and build peace among often diverse student communities. So in Nimale, for instance, that I mentioned, there's been, this conflict is framed ethnically, right? And, there have been people displaced from the area, people coming into the area, and huge amounts of tensions framed in ethnic terms. And then, of course, people's going to school together in these divided environments. And, I mean, it's such a shame you can't hear from Onyango, because, this title of the paper, Teachers Are For Everyone, was the inspiration also for the study, because it comes from an occasion when I, spent time in Nimale, and, all the students were giving Onyango free lifts on their bikes, the students who take little, do taxi rides on the motorbikes were giving him and me free lifts. And I was asking why, and he was saying, it's because they say teachers are for everyone. They were from a different community to Onyango, but they understood his social value. And that's because, he runs sports clubs, he does engage with students in different ways, and it's partly a survival question as well in these very difficult environments.
Okay, yeah, fascinating. So there's another question here for Sayan, which I just published. So So there's an ongoing struggle in Nigeria where history has been removed from school curriculum, primary through secondary, for years as a political class is controlling, hiding national realities. This speaks, I think, quite again similar to what is the role of the state and what's the interest of the state in education here. They're not a neutral actor. So have they? What is their interest in this education? And is this something you might have to consider when you're implementing your educational intervention?
Yes, I think it is a conversation that is happening in Nigeria about history, and I think because the country has had quite a very turbulent history in many ways. The Civil War certainly is one of the highlights. So I think it's important that history be brought back into the curriculum in some ways, and certainly at the primary school level as part of maybe social studies or something. But I think beyond that, I think or in line with that, maybe I shouldn't say beyond that. In line with that is imperative of delivering qualitative or quality functional education that young people can then use that has an utility beyond just impartation of knowledge, which is important, that they can use because of the structural dysfunction of the Nigerian labor market, where majority of those who are employed, who are in formal employment, and the public over-bloated, civil service. And that is feeding back to the kind of education that is delivered, is what is feeding into these structural dysfunction in the labor sector. And so that needs to change in terms of the education that is delivered, that people can use to actually create jobs rather than just, seek for jobs. But I agree. I think, history also has to be a key part in this conversation.
Okay, thanks a lot. There's a couple more questions I'm going to publish. After they've been answered, feel free to ask follow-up questions either by using the open podium or using the chat function or the extra or asking an extra question indeed. So this one, I think they're both for you, Rachel. So was the selection of 2 different border regions a practical and or deliberate choice in terms of your case study sites? And do these types of spaces particular perspectives on your research question? I'll just put it up again.
Yeah, so definitely it was partly practical and deliberate choice, in the sense that this project sort of partly came out of another wider research network with researchers in different sites, but it also came out of the fact that among this research network we had teachers, and teachers, former teacher in RBA and 2 teachers from the Nimale area, and those are the people that have been involved in this research. So really it was a sort of response to that opportunity of having involved in our research people who were actually practical experts on this question, as well as part-time researchers for the LSE conflict research program. But there's also kind of more scholarly reasons, I think, to compare these 2 sites, and they're interesting partly because of their differences, as well as they're also sites which actually have a kind of reputation for being among the kind of the areas from which a lot of educated elites have come from in the past and historically in South Sudan, and having a sort of history of education in a way that many areas, have seen even less education. So in some ways we think of these as places where we would expect to see some degree of history of valuing education and teachers, although there are differences, and also the kind of ethnic fractures of the conflict, the different types of conflict that affect the 2 areas gave opportunities for kind of a variety of perspectives to be included. But we're not sort of comparing them in a super sort of systematic way, rather we're seeing them as illustrative. And the fact that there are differences between them during this conflict help us to substantiate the point that despite these differences, teachers are sort of going about things in similar ways in trying to make education work at the local level. amid many constraints. I hope that answers.
Thanks. There's another question for you, Rachel, which I'll just publish again. So yeah, it's very interesting. So did you have examples of teachers misusing their power, dismantling peace even? And if it did happen, was there any way to deal with this?
Oh, I wish Onyango could respond. Of course, there are problems.
Yeah.
I mean, unquestionably, there are teachers who have. I mean, one of the things is, of course, let me give another example. For instance, I started my research in Nimale many years, before this study in 2014, and I began that research with a number of teachers who had actually been, kind of positively community activists, if you like. And increasingly over time, I've kind of studied this activism, which had began as civic, and ultimately many were displaced, and some of them joined the rebel opposition forces. So I can certainly trace, for instance, among my research participants in that wider study, which is all relating to a land grab in the Nimale area, not specifically on education, I can trace the history of teachers who previously were involved in civic activism and are now key figures in the Pagari Brigade, information officers or whatever. So yeah, I can definitely provide examples of that, but also in a more more everyday way. There are ways that teachers are sort of involved in levels of kind of petty corruption. So some of the aid that goes into the schools, sometimes it's disappeared. I mean, there's one or two examples we have of that. There's examples of kind of practical attempts to share it. There's examples of people coming to, for instance, there's lots of small examples of corruption. And then there's also a big issue around the exams. So the examination and the way that the examinations are now being held, a lot of teachers are very concerned about this. And some teachers have been involved in malpractices of releasing exams questions in advance, and money changing hands and so on. So there's definite problems at all levels there. And don't forget that many teachers are also not able to survive on their salary, so they're just not there some of the time. They're just absent, they're doing other things, they're trying to make a living in other ways apart from teaching sometimes.
It's really interesting. Lots of very similar to Columbia work, especially the multiple jobs, and then another kind of another responsibility being dumped on them almost. So not only you've got to prepare these pupils for employment, you've also got to make sure they're able to create peace in their communities. And the teacher's like, wow, how essentially? So okay, one for a form on Onyango actually for Sayan. Sayan, really sorry can't have you. There's a follow-up question for you, Rachel. I'll come back to in a second. I'm just think about it. So yeah, very sorry I can't hear you, Onyango. It'd be amazing to have your perspective. But your question for Sayan is, in terms of the capacity development in school, what is the level of education standards supported by NGOs? So how are NGOs supporting state delivery of education?
Yeah, so you have some NGOs setting up schools or temporary provisions in the settlement, because these are people who have been displaced and they are living in temporary shelters and temporary settlements. So there's a lot of NGO activities in terms of setting up temporary education provision in the settlement. Some of them, in mobile tents and so on. So yeah, that is the level of involvement. But I think what is absent is the kind of this long-term orientation. This kind of a strategic long-term orientation where NGOs involved are actually planning something that is more sustainable, because since they are going to be there, or they plan to be there for only a short time, to actually capacitate the community so that they can carry on, or they can put in place structures where this can carry on in the long term. So that is part of what is absent, and it's part of actually what informs this model that we're presenting. that there are resources within these communities. And as a kind of a side comment to the wider study that I've been carrying on in the region, we found that before many of these people were displaced, or rather in the aftermath of the original displacement, when they get into this settlement, when NGOs and governments come to help, the displaced people are saying, well, we want to leave these camps. We want to leave as soon as possible and resume our normal lives, less than the first couple of months. But after several months of benefiting from these, aid and support that are given, there's a kind of acquired dependency that comes as a result of it, where people then become used to it and they don't want to leave the camp. So originally, they were when they first got there, they wanted to leave. Can you help us? We just want to get out of here and carry on as normal. And that is also the kind of challenge we have. We are spotting with regard to the education provision. That it's more helpful to provide capacity for the community, not to do things for them, but to help them to do things for themselves. Because then when the NGOs leave, these people, and sometimes they move from settlement to settlement, they have that capacity to actually carry on and build on that and continue to do things for themselves. And that is the overarching logic, actually, of the care model, that use the resources that are within these communities. Some of them have secondary school qualification, put them on a kind of a pathway, to teacher training, and there are provisions within the country to link up with, the national, training system. And also the vocational, artisans that are within the community, co-opt them to deliver some kind of vocational training, provide them with additional kind of, formal training as well. So that when these populations move, the resources move with them, because the resources are within the community. So that is sort of, but at the moment, to go back, the final comment to the question, NGOs are involved, but it's more kind of short-term, intervention, which are useful, but not in the long term.
Okay, thanks a lot, Zain. Okay, just following up. So the previous question to Rachel was about sort of examples of peace being misused, basically, by teachers. So thank you for those examples. If that happens, can anything be done, and by whom?
Oh, this is for me. In terms of, the big question about, I guess, teachers ending up having to shift from civic practices into violent rebellion. The only thing, that's a bigger question about how do we address the conflict as a whole, right? And I obviously don't have a full answer to that, or couldn't give one here, but one of the things that I tried to highlight in my book on the South Sudan's injustice system is that, a lot of the part of the problem here also has to do with the repressive use of law, the way that law is also seen to kind of constitute and validate kind of people who are nominally the state, but actually lack legitimacy at the domestic level, and yet are regarded as the state externally, and are regarded as the government, the way in which law kind of acts repressively at all levels of society. So some of those, the community, for instance, were locked up, accused of a murder, illegally detained for a long period of time, all in attempts to resist the land grab. So there are bigger issues around that. In terms of what happens in the schools, I think Onyango would be a much better place to respond to that, unfortunately. But I think, it's very difficult if you're not paying teachers and you're not training teachers. These are the key areas for me, is, there needs to be a lot more investment in the basic paying and training of teachers. Now, I don't want to underestimate the complexity of that, because also how you pay them and how you get the money to them is also quite a complex question. But also what you train them to do, and how is also important. And this is one of the reasons I've just found it very fascinating also listening to Sayem's presentation. I think it probably has a lot of resonance, and all the points that Sayem was making regarding the issue of the short-term provision through NGOs is something that I've also heard Onyango and others in South Sudan making similar points. And I think, you know, it would have been fascinating, for instance, for you, for Sayed, to have talked with the people at our Action Research Forum, because I think they would have had a lot to learn and say to each other on those questions. I hope that answers. A bit fuzzy, but yeah.
Okay, so question, I'll just put it up. So question from me from Onyango. So for the how do teachers and education help solve the problem of land dispute centralization issues to reduce conflict? So that's a really good question, because the basic history of the Colombian conflict is the issue of land is at the very, very heart of it. And the which is a sticking point within the peace agreement that was signed in 2016, and any discussions of peace have to kind of approach this. So, but obviously this is not really something that can be discussed within schools. So when the government are saying we need to be contributing to a culture of peace, if by this they're just meaning like soft skills like empathy, conflict resolution skills, they're not. What they don't mean is not obviously resolving this issue, but discussing how to resolve this issue. It's a really kind of neutered understanding of peace, because it's not engaging with, I believe, the key driver of conflict in the country. And this was something that the teachers in school too definitely wanted to bring up when they were talking about personal experiences, because in terms of, we said, experiences of being displaced, that's all to do with the land, and you can't really understand the history of displacement unless you understand the conflict, why there's conflict over the land in the first place. But obviously, this is not necessarily a narrative the government wants to be existing or being pushed within schools. So we have this huge tension within what peace education means. So yeah, I mean, it's not. I think it obviously can't be solved in the schools, but I think asking that question really illustrates the kind of when you're thinking about what does peace education mean, it shows how kind of small a focus. Well, is this even really peace? What we're discussing, if it's not addressing the key cause of conflict, are we just kind of deceiving ourselves? Is it a different form of education, and just calling it peace education, just almost a lie we're telling teachers and the pupils? So yeah, that's a very, very interesting question, I thought, and it really illustrates a key problem within the approach that I saw. Okay, we're coming up to 10:40. Are there any follow? Oh yes. Oh, let's try to put it in text form. Onyango's asked a question. I think I'm not quite sure.
I sent the question to the chat, but maybe Rachel has already spoken to it. But I sent one question there.
Mm-hmm.
But she has spoken to it a bit anyway.
Yeah.
It's about the design of interventions by NGOs, but
I think that's been answered. Okay, any further questions or comments from anyone? Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much for, first of all, the presenters for logging on. I don't think there's been too many technical hitches. This is my first kind of virtual panel. I thought it was really good in terms of means you can do it in your home. So thank you very much for attending. It was really interesting presentations as well in terms of the different challenges and opportunities as well that's facing education, and how it can be used in conflict areas, and how what is reasonable to put onto the shoulders of education and teachers as well. I think that's been, it really came out in all three presentations, but also the key interests that are at play when you're asking people or schools and individuals to teach for peace. What does that mean in the practicalities of life? What are the interests that are going to have to be navigated within this within them being asked to do this? So it's really interesting to see the differences, but also kind of the similarities in terms of kind of the theoretical questions that were being asked and answered in each one. Okay,